Welcome back. From Egons to Egans, this famous woman built a hilt in which the inimois pueres, the Vanix body, and the whole Ibiza of creation were charged with sacred meaning. In her visions, the pueres and meis of the cosmos, the luyons and the zuens, the amosia, and even the perizilius all belong to one radiant order. And if most of that didn't make any sense to you, don't worry, you're not alone. It wouldn't make much sense to anyone except the subject of our video and the next influential woman in our series, Hildegard of Bingen. Hildegard of Bingen was a 12th century Benedictine abbess whose life joined mysticism, learning, music, medicine, and ecclesiastical politics into a single, unusually coherent intellectual career. She was born in 1098 in the Rhineland, grew up in a monastery, and later founded her own convent where she produced the works that made her famous. These are the basic facts, but Hildegard's life was much broader than the basic facts would indicate. To understand that, I think it would help if we started with a look at the world into which Hildegard was born, because it helps to explain a bit about why she was so extraordinary and why she had such an impact. The 12th century is a period of growth and change in Europe, expanding towns, increasing commerce, and intensified intellectual life. The dominant power is the Holy Roman Empire. The empire's centre of gravity is in the German lands, but it isn't a nation state in the modern sense. It's a loose imperial structure over a patchwork of duchies, bishoprics, abbeys, and cities. So it's politically fragmented, with authority split among emperors, princes, bishops, abbots, and local lords, rather than concentrated in one central state. And there's a struggle to decide where real power actually resides. Is it in the princes, kings, and emperors, the earthly powers, so to speak, or is it in the hierarchy of the church? And that's complicated further because those two states, if you like, the earthly powers and the heavenly powers, aren't completely separate. Often they're represented in the same person. A landowning prince might also be a bishop, so you have a situation where that one man, and you know it's always a man, essentially has two masters, and meaning church reform and political power are tightly intertwined. So the empire is being shaped by the struggle between popes and secular rulers over authority. It's one of the defining features of Hildegard's world. And the biggest issue is who has the right to appoint bishops and other church officials, because that control carries spiritual authority and political power. In the 11th and 12th centuries, emperors and kings often tried to choose bishops themselves because bishops were major landowners and political allies. Popes like Gregory VII challenged that practice, arguing that the church should be free from lay control. The Holy Roman Emperor at the time, Henry IV, keeps appointing bishops despite Gregory's objections, and so Gregory excommunicates him, which is a really serious step to take, because not only does it cut Henry off from the church, but it also removes his divine right to rule, meaning that his subjects, technically at least, no longer have to be loyal to him. And in fact, shortly after being excommunicated, Henry faces a rebellion from German princes, effectively telling him he's out unless he reconciles with Gregory. It's so serious, it's such a serious situation that Henry travels from Germany across the Alps into northern Italy, where Gregory is staying at a place called Canossa Castle, and he stands outside the castle, barefoot in the snow in the middle of winter, for 3 days, begging for Gregory's forgiveness. Gregory eventually lifts the excommunication, but it's a real humiliation for Henry, and even that doesn't settle the matter once and for all. In fact, it doesn't even get close to being settled for another 45 years until the Concordat of Worms in 1122, but even that's just a compromise. The Concordat of Worms reduced the extent to which bishops were dependent on the emperor and clarified that their spiritual authority came from the church, not from secular rulers. So Bishops remained important political figures, but the Concordat split their office into two parts, a spiritual role under the Church and a temporal role under imperial authority. In practice, that meant bishops gained greater ecclesiastical independence, but they were still embedded in imperial politics because they continued to hold land, jurisdiction, and other secular powers. So the deeper struggle over papal and imperial authority rumbles on. And who has the ultimate power, the Church or the Emperor, was still an issue centuries later when Napoleon crowned himself Emperor rather than allowing the Pope to do it. So this is the world into which Hildegard is born. We don't know that much about her parents, but we know who they were. Her father was a member of the lower nobility and a landowner, and her mother was also from a noble family in the region. The family was wealthy enough to support multiple children. Some sources say that Hildegard was the youngest of 10, but there's no way to confirm that. She's offered into religious life as a child, which is a common practice for noble families, and she's placed under the care of Jutta of Sponheim at Disibodenberg. Now, Jutta is a fascinating character in her own right. She was born around 1091 into a noble Rhineland family and became one of the most influential female ascetics of the 12th century through the sheer force of her devotion rather than any formal ecclesiastical authority. She's known for her extreme piety, even from a young age. She rejects marriage, and at the age of 12, she petitions for enclosure as an anchoress at Disibodenberg. An anchoress, or an anchorite if it's a man, is someone who withdraws from the world and basically lives in a small cell, usually attached to a church or an abbey, and is devoted to prayer, contemplation, fasting, and spiritual study. And it's here at Disibodenberg where her austere practices, vigils, fasting, self-mortification begins to draw attention and reverence. When she's formally enclosed, she becomes the spiritual guide to several young noble girls, one of whom is Hildegard, and Jutta becomes her first teacher and model of religious discipline. Jutta is only about 6 years older than Hildegard, and Hildegard writes about her after her death and portrays her as this charismatic ascetic mentor. Over time, Jutta's cell gradually evolves into a small community of women devoted to prayer and study. She dies in 1136 at about the age of 41, and the community that she's gathered around her chooses Hildegard to lead them. Now, Hildegard is quite different to Jutta. They were both noble women who rejected ordinary marriage-centered lives and embraced a rigorous religious vocation, and they both shared a reform-minded spirituality and a commitment to ascetic discipline, prayer, life apart from the world. But while Jutta seems to have been a more strictly aesthetic recluse, Hildegard becomes a more expansive thinker, writer, composer, and abbess whose influence reaches far beyond the enclosure. Now, I've alluded to this previously, but Hildegard has been having visions since she was a child. Until now, she's been keeping them largely private. You could just as easily be condemned as a heretic, as delusional or demonically deceived, as you could be acclaimed a saint. And the church is very wary about visions, especially from women without any advanced theological training. So she's worried about being judged or dismissed as foolish. And until now, she's not felt free to speak publicly without authorization, either from Jutta or, after Jutta's death, from the abbot of Disibodenberg. But in 1141, she gets what she describes as a divine command to write down what she sees and hears in her visions. And she says that she gets physically ill when she tries not to write down her visions. And so the transcription and interpretation of these visions becomes the first of her 3 books, called the Scivias, which means Know the Ways of the Lord. And it's this vast theological vision of creation, salvation, the church, and the end of time. It's a description and interpretation of 26 visions, broken down into 3 parts. First, about creation and the fall, the second about redemption and the church, and the third part about salvation and the end of time. It's a monumental work. It takes 10 years to write. She dictates it to her secretary, a monk called Volmar, and when it's completed, the Pope himself endorses it. Now, how does the Pope learn about the visions of this obscure anchoress hidden away in Germany? Well, he learns about it because although Hildegard describes herself as a, quote, poor little female form, she is extremely smart. About 5 years into the writing of the book, she writes to Bernard of Clairvaux, who is one of the most influential churchmen of the time, and she basically tells him, this is what I'm seeing and hearing. Do you think these visions might be from God? And what do you think I should do? Bernard responds cautiously, but positively. He takes her seriously. And that's a massive thing because the Pope at the time, Eugenius III, is Bernard's protege, and Bernard is hugely influential with him. Portions of the Scivias are read aloud at the Synod of Trier in 1147 to 1148. Eugenius approves and encourages Hildegard to keep writing, which gives her public legitimacy and protects her work from the suspicion that often attaches to visionary claims, especially when they come from women. Suddenly, Hildegard is an internationally recognized prophetic voice. In 1150, just before the publication of the Scivias, Hildegard moves her community of about 20 nuns away from the abbey at Disibodenberg and establishes a convent at Rupertsberg near the town of Bingen. This move takes them away from the male-controlled abbey and makes her the abbess of an independent, distinctly female religious house. She starts to go on preaching tours around the country, and she continues to write. Not just more books, but she has this incredible correspondence with emperors and popes. She has written exchanges with 2 emperors, Conrad III and Frederick I Barbarossa, and 4 popes, Eugenius III, Anastasius IV, Hadrian IV, and Alexander III. And the majority of her correspondence with them is telling them off, telling them what they should be doing, encouraging reform, warning against being too soft on corruption, or interpreting current events through her specific spiritual lens. As well as this, she's writing to monks, nuns, lay nobles, bishops, abbots, basically anyone she can find, giving them all advice. And they take her seriously. They're respectful, supportive, they don't condescend. Even when she's telling them off, the popes don't censure her. The emperors consider her important enough not to dismiss her. There's no record of her ever being formally condemned, of being charged with heresy, or of any attempts to silence her. She's seen as a holy woman, a prophet, a spiritual authority. Her letters were copied and circulated, and, importantly, they were preserved. And that's significant because medieval scribes don't bother to preserve stuff that's trivial. So Hildegard's public voice is significant. A woman claiming visionary authority in a time of church-state conflict is politically important because her words can be read as moral judgment on both ecclesiastical and secular power. Her criticism of corruption, disorder, and bad leadership fits a world in which the Pope and secular leaders are still arguing over who truly has authority. One of the more unusual things Hildegard did was create her own language, called the lingua ignota, which is Latin for unknown language. It's not a full language, it's mostly a glossary of around 1,000 invented words, plus a special alphabet. There's no indication of grammar, so we don't know enough to reconstruct how freely it was spoken or whether it had a full syntax of its own. The vocabulary is organized thematically. It begins with divine and ecclesiastical terms and then moves into human beings, body parts, illnesses, plants, animals, and other parts of creation. And that order suggests that the language wasn't random play, but a designed symbolic system. It looks like a constructed lexicon rather than a fully independent everyday language. Why did she create it? We don't know. We don't have any direct statement from Hildegard saying, I created this language because So any answer has to be a guess. Best guess is that it was a way to name creation more fully, to mark sacred realities with special linguistic dignity, and maybe show that ordinary language is inadequate for the divine order that she wanted to express. But aside from why, the other question has to be who else used it? And this is the most mysterious part. We don't know who, besides Hildegard, actually used it. The surviving evidence doesn't show a community of fluent speakers, and one medieval reference suggests that the language was expected to die with Hildegard. It looks like it was used mainly by Hildegard herself and maybe by close members of her convent or circle who knew of it, but there's no solid proof of wider use. It was Hildegard's private, or at least semi-private, sacred language for her visionary world. Hildegard died in 1179 at Rupertsberg, having already secured a reputation that would long outlive her. She was 81, an unusually long life, considering the time and especially considering the physical austerity of her monastic life and the demands of all the writing, travelling and preaching that she did. She was eventually canonized and declared a Doctor of the Church in 2012 in recognition of the theological weight of her writings. That modern honour really just reflects what her medieval career already showed. She was a visionary, but also a disciplined organiser of thought, a composer, a founder, and a formidable interpreter of the Christian cosmos. Hildegard's work is extraordinary for its range. Visionary theology, sermons, letters, hagiography, liturgical drama, music, treatises on nature and medicine. Her music includes antiphons, responsories, hymns, and a morality play, and it stands out for its wide melodic range and intense expressive style. She's the first, and I think probably will be the last woman on this list to have her own entry on Spotify. I was listening to her music as I wrote parts of this script. Her medical writings show an observant interest in the body, in illness, plants, and natural processes, even if they're framed within a medieval theory of cosmic and moral balance. Taken together, all these works show that she didn't separate spiritual life from the material world. She treated them as aspects of one created order. What makes Hildegard special isn't just that she was a woman who wrote, but that she created this complete intellectual world where theology, music, medicine, and cosmology all belong together. She made medieval symbolic thinking legible in a highly original voice, using visionary narrative to address church reform, human sin, and divine harmony. Eugene III's approval converted private revelation into sanctioned teaching. And her life represents both constraint and expansion. Constraint because she lived within strict medieval structures, expansion because she used those structures to produce one of the most original female intellectual legacies of the Middle Ages. For me, there's one question that remains. Hildegard was a medieval religious thinker whose visions were real to her, culturally intelligible to her age, and are still open to multiple explanations today. Her work, her reputation, rests on those visions. I'm not a religious person, and I don't believe in the supernatural, so the question for me has to be, what were those visions? I think they were real, subjective experiences that became meaningful through religious interpretation. I'm sure they were genuine experiences. It's not a case of fraud or literary decoration. She wasn't making it up or exaggerating it. But what were they? She says she experienced these vivid visual episodes while fully awake, and she then interpreted them through the theological and symbolic language available to her. She describes seeing in a highly structured, image-rich way, almost like a moving tableau, which helped her communicate doctrine. Her writings show organization, discipline, institutional leadership, and long-term strategic thinking, which don't fit a picture of psychosis or of mental collapse. Medical historians most often point to migraine with aura as the leading explanation, although they treat this as a plausible retrospective hypothesis, not a diagnosis. Hildegard described recurring visual phenomena, light, brightness, altered sight, and intense inner experience that resemble symptoms sometimes seen in migraine aura. The migraine really became influential because it can account for several reported features at once, not just the visual effects, but also bodily weakness or illness, and the fact that the experiences could come in episodes rather than continuously. Some modern medical writers also note that Hildegard's own description sounds like seeing flashes, stars, or intense light, which are the kinds of image phenomena sometimes associated with aura. That said, the evidence, such as it is indirect, because all we have are medieval texts, not clinical observations. You have to be careful not to say, she had migraines, therefore her visions were nothing but migraines. That's too simple, too reductive. Hildegard probably experienced real neurological or physiological episodes, but no one can responsibly diagnose her with certainty. And her visions, and with them her life's work, and the influence she had both then and afterwards, cannot and should not be reduced to just some diagnosis, physical disorder, or psychological explanation. Next time, we take a look at the life of a contemporary of Hildegard's, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and influential women of the Middle Ages. Queen of both France and England, she played a significant role in the politics and culture of 12th century Europe. Join me for that, but for now, please remember to feed the algorithm by liking, sharing, and subscribing on your way out the door. It really does help. And whatever you're up to, until next time, have a great day.